Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at GridBagLayout, which is a layout manager. So in the last tutorial I created this little program, and in this panel here I've actually given it, it's called Form Panel, and I've actually given it some text fields and labels which I now want to add to the panel. And to do that I'm going to use the most powerful but also perhaps the trickiest of the layout managers. And you're probably going to wonder as I show you this if it isn't easier to use a visual designer such as the Window Builder Pro, which is free Eclipse plugin that I showed you in the first tutorial in this series. And the answer is that it could be perhaps quicker, but the visual designers for Java at the moment don't seem to be very good, to be honest. And it's going to help a lot if you know this stuff anyway. And all the Java developers that I've actually worked with or known personally have pretty much shunned visual designers in favour of doing this by hand. There seems to be a real culture of it in Java, and you'll probably see why if you start using the visual designers and you see how rubbish they are, to be honest. But nevertheless, Window Builder Pro is probably the best of the bunch. So let's get on with it, having said that. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say set layout, of course. Set layout, new grid bag layout. And GridBagLayout is so flexible that the developers that I've known, including myself, tend to just stick with this one layout, and we don't really use for example box layout or grid layout much, because this is so flexible. And once you've learned the quirks of this, you can pretty much just use this for most purposes. So I'm going to start by, now GridBagLayout actually you have a grid bag constraints object that you use with GridBagLayout. So I'll call that GC and set that equal to a new grid bag constraints. And grid bag constraints has a whole bunch of fields, and you've got to initialize those fields before you use it in any serious way. So I'm going to start by doing that. So I'll say GC dot, and perhaps the most important is the grid X and grid Y. And grid X and grid Y, so the idea is that you're laying out your components in a grid, but the cells in the grid can be very flexibly sized, and it can also span columns or rows. And the cell at position 0, 0 is in the top left hand corner here. So as we increase X, we go from left to right, and as we increase Y, we go from top down to bottom. But if you just have one grid cell, then it's going to be in the middle. So you'll see how this works as I go along here. I'm going to say gc.gridY equals 0. Now another very important thing to set here is the weight. I'm going to say gc.weightX equals 1, and gc.weightY equals 1 as well. And the weight controls for a given cell, the weight will control how much space it takes up relative to the other cells. So this number here, it doesn't have to, it's not important what the number is in itself. What is important is how this number compares to the other weights that you assign to the other cells. And finally you might want to set gc.fill. That can be set to horizontal, vertical, none, or both, and that tells your components whether to take up all the space in the cell or not. And I probably don't want mine to, so I'm going to say grid bag constraints.none. And it's pretty important to set this lot at the start, because if you leave any of it out, you tend to get problems later which can really have you tearing your hair out. So first I'm going to add the top leftmost component, which is going to be name label. So I'll say add name label. These are the components I created in the last tutorial in this series, and I pass add GC there. Now if I run this, name labels appearing in the center of the panel because there's only one cell at the moment, so whether you call it top left or top right or what you like makes no difference, because if there's only one, it's going to be in the middle. But let's now say gc.grid x equals 1, so I'm going from left to right, and gc.grid y still equals 0. And so gc.grid y is not changing, and I'm going to reuse this GridBag constraints. But the reason that I'm typing this again is just to make it clearer in the code what's happening. And that is a big problem with GridBag constraints, that you tend to lose track of what's happening. So you really need to kind of divide up your form into kind of logical parts, you know, and maybe put comments in the code and that kind of thing, or use tricks like this as well, for redefining variables that you don't need to. Okay, so let's do add name field, comma GC, and if I add that, it's going to be 1 along in X, and it's going to be here. And if your text field appears extremely tiny, you've probably forgotten to set the text field width here, so don't forget that. So let's go ahead and say gc.grid y now equals 1, and gc.grid x I'm going to set back to 0, and I'll do add occupation label, comma GC. So this is adding a new row, so I've gone down 1 in y and it's down here, and then I'll say gc.grid y still equals 1, and gc.grid x equals 1 as well, and add occupation field, comma GC. And so now I've got my field in here, and finally I'm going to add a button down here. So I'm going to say gc.grid y equals 2, and gc.grid x equals 1, so I'm adding it in the second column, and the first column is number 0 of course, and add OK button, comma GC, like this. Now if I run that, the button's going to appear down here. Okay, so that's great, except that it looks like a donkey's ass because of the alignment and the fact that everything's completely spread out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move these labels over to the right so that they're flush with the text fields, and I'm going to make sure that the text fields are moved over to the left rather than being centered. And the way I do that is, before I add the labels, I have to say gc.anchor, and this specifies the side of the cell that the control sticks to, if you like. So I'm going to say gc.anchor equals grid, and let's try GridBag constraints.line start. Line start. So line start means it's like the start of the line. It's like basically east. It's down here. There's also first line start, which will be up here, top left, or last line start down here. Last line end is bottom left, and first line end bottom right. First line end top right. You probably get the idea. So I'm going to use line start here, and I'll copy that because I want to also make the second label go to the, actually I don't want the line start, I actually want it to be line end, because I want it to stick to the right hand side of the cell which is in the first column, and I also want my my button and my label and my text fields to stick to the line start, to the left hand side of the second column. So here, if I go to the field and I change this to line start, and before I add the occupation field, I'll have line start as well, and I don't actually need to repeat it, but just for clarity here I'll set this to line start as well, although it's still line start because I used it here. Okay, so there we go. The alignment is a little bit better, and now I would like I'd like these the kind of controls to be up here somewhere rather than spreading out vertically like this. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make the first and second rows very small, and I'm going to make the last row take up all the space just to start with. So I'm going to go to the weight Y, and this is the weight Y for the first row here, and let's take this out because I haven't set this out. I haven't set this every time. I'm going to move this to here, and let's maybe rearrange this a bit. Oh no, it's as good as it is because this is all the first row. So let's put some comments in here, which will help a lot. First row, and let's have a comment here. So in the next section, I've got grid Y equal to 1. So then it's going to be second row, and finally I've got the button, which is in the third row down here. And these are kind of lengths you have to go to keep things clear with GridBag layouts. This is the third row. And for the first row, I'm going to set the weight X and weight, well, I'm going to set the weight Y. I can leave the weight X as it is, I think, but I can set the weight Y to a very small value, like 0.1. And I can have that set to 0.1 for the second row as well. And then for the third row, I'm going to set the weight Y to a much bigger value, like 1.0, so that the third row takes up most of the space. And if I run that, it looks like this, which is an improvement. In fact, let's make this last row even bigger and see how that looks. So yeah, these are now more bunched together. And I want the button here to be not at the line start, which is here on the left, but first line start, which is here. Because conceptually it's like this is the first line here, then the line, and then the last line, and we've got line start and end. So let's make that first line start for the button, the anchor. So here I can say instead of line start, first line start, and if I run that, the button's now anchored up here, which I think you'll agree looks a lot better. And there's one last little change that I'd like to make here, because I want my labels to have a little bit of space after the end. And I could do that actually by just putting some space actually in the label text itself. But because I want to show you something quite important, I'm going to do it a slightly different way. I'm going to use a indent, so I'm going to look for where the labels are now. So here's the occupation label, and up here is the name label. And before adding those, I'm going to say gc.indent, I think it's called indent, gc.insets, sorry, equals new insets. And if you look at the insets class, do Ctrl-Shift-O to add the import, and put the cursor there, and let's have a look. It's got the arguments are top, left, bottom, right, although to be honest with you, sometimes I've tried inserting values for insets and they've seemed to be in the wrong order. So let's try this today and see what happens anyway. I want to have an inset on the right there. So what I'm going to try doing is, this is top, left, bottom, right, like that. And I'm going to have the same inset before the occupation label. And for the other controls, I'm going to have the insets. Now if I remember rightly, I can just set these to null. But if that doesn't work, I'm going to set it to like a blank insets object. So after I've set the insets there, I've then done away with it. And I've set the insets here. So I'll do away with it again here. And let's also do away with it before I add the button here. And let's see if that works. So if I run that, now I've got an error because my memory is bad here. And I actually need to do just a new blank insets instead of null, except that there's no constructor with no parameters. So let's set it to 0, and I'm confident this will work. So wherever I've got insets equal to null, I'm going to set it equal to 0 so that there's no padding. And of course, if I was worried about efficiency here, I could create just one insets object, or 2 in this case, and I could reuse them where I need them. But if I run that, now we've got a little bit of space. It should be 5 pixels, but who knows if it really is exactly 5 pixels on the right hand side of the labels here. Now that's it for this tutorial. In the next tutorial we're going to look at hooking this little panel up so that it actually does something, and we're going to use kind of the listener model that I've already explained. But don't worry if you didn't fully understand it last time, because we're going to go over it again, and I'm actually going to use an event object to carry information from here up to the controller, the main frame, and I'm going to output it in this text area here. So until next time, happy coding.